Welcome back to Episodes of Kynn. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the psychology of silent revenge, the kind that never raises its voice, never names what happened, and somehow still manages to punish someone completely. This audio recording includes subtitles, so you can follow along more intentionally and absorb the ideas at your own pace. You've probably been on both sides of this without ever calling it what it actually is. The friend who stops responding as quickly after you said the wrong thing, offering no explanation, just a slow, deliberate cooling you're supposed to notice and interpret correctly on your own. The partner who agrees everything is fine, then quietly stops doing the small things they used to do without being asked. The coworker who suddenly becomes very correct and very distant after being passed over for something, polite enough that you can't point to anything specific, cold enough that you feel it in every interaction. Nobody raised their voice, nobody said a single accusatory word, and yet somehow, everyone involved knows exactly what's happening. This is silent revenge, and it's one of the most common, least discussed forms of conflict that exists, precisely because it's built to be deniable. Here's where this pattern usually starts, and it starts with a lesson learned early, often long before anyone could put words to it. Somewhere in childhood, most people who become fluent in silent revenge learned that direct anger didn't work, or worse, that it actively made things worse. Maybe expressing frustration openly got met with punishment, dismissal, or ridicule. Maybe conflict in the household was loud, frightening, or simply never resolved anything, so anger stopped looking like a useful tool and started looking like a risk not worth taking. But the anger itself didn't disappear just because expressing it directly became unsafe. It had to go somewhere, and it found a quieter route, one that didn't require the vulnerability of saying what was actually wrong, or the risk of being told your feelings didn't matter. This is the first thing worth understanding about silent revenge. It's rarely chosen because it feels good or effective in some grand strategic sense. It's chosen because it feels safer than the alternative. Direct confrontation requires you to name a grievance out loud, to risk being contradicted, dismissed, or told you're overreacting, to sit in the discomfort of someone else's reaction to your honesty. Withdrawal requires none of that. You get to feel the satisfaction of the other person noticing something is wrong, feel the quiet justice of watching them scramble to figure out what they did, all without ever having to expose the actual vulnerability underneath your anger, which is usually something closer to hurt, or fear of not mattering, than pure aggression. Here's the hidden cost, though, and it's a cost almost nobody weighs honestly in the moment. Silent revenge feels like control, but it actually creates a strange kind of powerlessness for everyone involved, including the person delivering it. Because the grievance is never named, it can never actually be resolved. The other person is left guessing, sometimes accurately, often not, which means they're frequently apologizing for the wrong thing, overcorrecting in ways that don't address what actually hurt you, while the real issue sits untouched underneath the whole exchange. And because nothing was ever said clearly, there's no clean way to know when it's over. Should they apologize more, wait longer, do something specific? Nobody knows, including, often, the person administering the silence, who sometimes keeps the withdrawal running well past the point where they even remember exactly why they started it. This is where the deeper psychological mechanism becomes clear. Silent revenge lets someone feel morally justified while still causing real harm, and that combination is exactly what makes it so appealing to the part of the mind that wants to punish without accepting the discomfort of being seen as someone who punishes. If you confront someone directly, you have to own your anger. You have to stand behind the claim that they hurt you and risk that claim being challenged. If you withdraw instead, you get to occupy a much safer identity, the reasonable one, the one who never raised their voice, never said anything unkind, never did anything a reasonable observer could point to as an attack. Meanwhile, the actual function is identical. Someone is being made to suffer for something, deliberately, with intention behind it. The only difference is that one method leaves fingerprints and the other doesn't. There's a specific kind of satisfaction embedded in this that's worth naming honestly, because pretending it isn't there only makes the pattern harder to recognize in yourself. Watching someone notice your coldness, watching them try harder, apologize more, tiptoe more carefully around you, activates something that feels a lot like justice, especially if you felt unheard or dismissed in the relationship before. The problem is that this satisfaction is almost always temporary and rarely resolves the actual injury underneath it, because the other person is responding to your behavior, not to your actual grievance, which they were never given the chance to hear or address directly. You can watch someone suffer for weeks and still feel exactly as unresolved as you did on day one, because suffering was never actually the same thing as being understood. Here's what makes this pattern so corrosive over time, in a way that's easy to miss because each individual instance feels small and justified on its own. Every time silent revenge succeeds, meaning every time it produces the reaction you wanted, without you having to say anything vulnerable out loud, it gets reinforced as the go-to response. And every time it's used instead of direct communication, the relationship loses a small amount of its capacity for real repair, because real repair requires both people to know what actually happened. A relationship where grievances get delivered as silence instead of words slowly turns into a relationship built on guesswork, where both people are constantly managing an atmosphere instead of addressing actual issues, and where genuine closeness becomes harder and harder to access, because closeness requires exactly the kind of direct honesty this pattern was built to avoid. This is also why silent revenge tends to escalate rather than resolve conflict over the long run, even though it feels, in any single instance, like the calmer, more controlled option. Because nothing gets named, resentments accumulate instead of clearing. Each new instance of withdrawal often carries the weight of every previous unresolved instance underneath it, which is why a small, forgettable slight can sometimes be met with a withdrawal that seems wildly disproportionate to what just happened. It usually isn't really about what just happened. It's about everything that came before it that never got a name either. There's a final layer to this worth understanding, particularly if you've noticed this pattern in your own behavior rather than just in others. The defense that usually protects this habit from being examined honestly is the belief that you're simply protecting your peace, staying calm, refusing to engage in unnecessary conflict. And sometimes that's genuinely true. Choosing not to escalate every disagreement is a reasonable, healthy skill. But it's worth being honest with yourself about the difference between actually letting something go and quietly punishing someone while telling yourself you've let it go. The test isn't whether you raised your voice. It's whether the coldness has an expiration date attached to genuine resolution, or whether it's simply running until the other person figures out, through trial and error, what will finally make it stop. So what actually replaces this, if silent revenge feels safer than direct confrontation ever will? Not suppression, and not swinging to the opposite extreme of expressing every flicker of irritation the moment it happens. It starts with naming the actual grievance plainly, even in a small, low-stakes way, and tolerating the discomfort of doing so without immediately retreating into distance the moment it feels exposing. This is uncomfortable specifically because it requires the vulnerability silent revenge was designed to avoid in the first place, admitting what actually hurt, and risking the other person's response to that admission. But it's the only version of the exchange that gives the other person a real chance to understand and repair something, instead of guessing at a punishment with no clear terms for ending it. It also means getting honest, privately, about the specific satisfaction silence provides, and asking whether that satisfaction is actually solving anything, or simply giving you the feeling of justice, while the real issue quietly calcifies underneath it. Because the truth about silent revenge is that it was never really about protecting your peace. It was about avoiding the risk of saying, "Clearly, this hurt me," and hoping the silence would say it for you instead. It rarely does, not fully, and the relationships that survive long-term are almost never the ones built on someone else correctly guessing what they did wrong. They're the ones where somebody, eventually, was willing to just say it. If any part of this resonated with you, if you've ever gone quiet instead of saying what actually hurt, or been on the receiving end of a silence you couldn't quite decode, leave a comment and let me know what stood out. Chances are, you're not the only one who's done this. Thanks for listening to episodes of Kynn. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.